just going to turn that one off so I don't get confused. So as we mentioned last week, after we finished up Romans, our thought was to go back and pick up some of those lessons that we've missed in our Life of Christ study, because of the kind of the way those lessons are formatted and the way that we've been using them up to this point in the year. We have skipped over quite a few lessons, so there's just a lot of information left unstudied that we can go back and look at. And then later on, when Johnny and I are able to kind of get our Wednesday night study in sync with one another, and we're both here all the time, we kind of may choose to branch out at some point then and go back into some other textual studies or something along those lines. So I was just looking over the lessons that we didn't cover on the Sunday morning studies and noticed that there's kind of a whole block of lessons that were devoted to the Sermon on the Mount, and we only got half of those because we only do the Sunday morning Bible class lesson, and then they also have another class lesson that goes with each of those. So I can't imagine that we would leave out part of the Sermon on the Mount and not study the whole thing. So we're going to kind of focus on some of those lessons. So that's where we're at today. And we're going to look at lessons from the Sermon on the Mount. The first one that we're going to look at for tonight is the lesson that comes directly after the Beatitudes. We know, if you're familiar with the Sermon on the Mount at all, as most of you probably are, then you know that sermon kind of starts off with the Beatitudes, and that sets the stage. It sets the tone for everything else that follows. And so we'll look at what comes immediately after that. We'll get some thoughts in tonight about what it means to be the salt and the light. So I like, before we get into the text, don't read ahead, don't yet. I've got it to be on the board, so if you're reading, stop. Because we'll do that together here in a minute. But I like, one of the things that just struck me as I went through this lesson that was prepared, and he makes the comment, that kind of along the way here, he said, let's look at these verses and see if there's some new insights or new information that we can glean from these, even though we've probably read these verses 1,000 times. I mean, these are not unfamiliar passages. For anybody who has even a cursory knowledge of the Bible, these passages are going to be familiar. And for the Wednesday night crowd, it's going to be something that we've studied before. It's going to be something that we've not just read, but something that we've studied. And so he frames this whole conversation, or this whole lesson, within the first thing is about, the first statement that he makes after he lists the passages, low self-esteem is a serious issue, which, it is. Whether you like the discussion about it or not, it's true that it is. And the impact that low self-esteem can have on people, it can be seen I see it every day in school. I see it every day in school with kids that struggle with understanding how valuable they are, how important they are in other people's lives. And its impact can be seen on college students. Its impact can be seen in some older adults as well. So, and then he kind of just makes a couple of comments. If you lack self-esteem, it can dictate your performance in a negative way. And not just on a school test, but in every aspect of your life and everything that you do, it's going to have an effect. And so then he asked the question, well, what does that have to do with the Sermon on the Mount? And now we're going to read Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16. It says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how will it be made salty again? It is good for nothing anymore except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do men light a lamp and put it under the peck measure, but on the lampstand. And it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." So this is the text that we're covering for tonight. Sometimes these lessons have us covering entire chapters, and it's kind of hard to get through all the material tonight. We've got 4 verses, and we're gonna really kind of camp out here, and we're gonna talk about just kind of get in depth with what it means to be the salt and the light. But I like the way that that it draws in the connection between the salt and the light to the Beatitudes. I think typically when we've studied through, or at least when I've studied through the Sermon on the Mount, we do exactly what this lesson plan kind of does, which is we break out chunks of it and we study the Beatitudes, and then we study these next 4 verses, and then we study the next 6 or 8 verses, and then we study the next 6 or 8 verses. Sometimes we lose sight of that context. We lose sight of the fact that this is a coherent series of statements, or a series of lessons that are being presented by Jesus, and he doesn't just give sound bites. He doesn't just give little pithy statements that's going to be on the news that night. He's giving us an entire sequence of things that he lines up together for a purpose. And so when you think of the Beatitudes, and I didn't put the Beatitudes in the slides, but if you got your Bibles there, we can just go back and look at the verses that come immediately before that, verses 1 through 12. It says, when he saw the multitudes, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. In opening his mouth, he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men cast insults at you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is in heaven. For your reward in heaven is great, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So we've already, this would be maybe more impactful or more powerful if this was directly after we had just had that lesson on the Beatitude, when those things were still fresh in our minds. But as we studied through those Beatitudes, we talked about them being really, they're character building things. They're really about who we are supposed to be as followers of Christ. And they really reveal or define the character that God expects us to have. So then these verses that we're looking at tonight about being salt and light follow directly after that thought about, here's the character or the disposition, the attributes of the people that are going to bear my name, that are going to be my people. These are the people that I want them to be. And then what? After we're those people, or in the process of becoming those people, or as we're honing those characteristics and we're using those characteristics to define ourselves, then what? What does that mean? And he follows it with these verses. It means we then, because of those characteristics, because of those attributes, we are the salt of the earth. We are the light of the world.
Characteristics and attributes, that's why people cast insults on them.
Uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely. There's absolutely a connection there.
Not that we're looking for it, but if someone's not insulting us, maybe we're trying to be too friendly with too many people or something.
If we're not suffering insults or being if people aren't noticing that we're Christ followers, then maybe we're not following close enough. And
that could be a maturity thing.
Well, yeah, and we'll actually talk a little bit about that tonight as we go through. That's kind of fits with one of the points that he makes in the lesson. So, I like that this ties these statements about being salt and light. It ties it to our worth, who we are as people, as humans, and what God sees in us, the potential that God sees in us to have an impact on those around us, to have a meaningful existence in this world. I love that he ties that back to the Beatitudes, which is that character building, that those defining attributes about who we're supposed to be. And then as we develop those characteristics and we become that person, then it reveals to the world around us the worth that God sees in us, the importance that God places on us as his children. So that's kind of the context for the lesson tonight, that that the message of the Beatitudes, or the message rather of this section that we're looking at tonight, the message of the idea of being salt and light, is that we are important. God sees us as important in his plan. And if we don't see ourselves as important, then we're kind of pitting ourselves against God. God's saying, you are important for what I want to happen in this world. And then we kind of sit back sometimes and we say, well, just, I'm nobody. I'm not anything. Well, that's not the way God sees it. God sees us as being very important. Okay, so let's move into kind of talking then about the idea of what it means to be salt and light. So he starts off, you are the salt of the earth. That's the first statement there in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. And there's some things listed here about, why that's a good comparison. Why is it that when we say somebody is the salt of the earth, that's a pillar of the community. Yeah, that's like a compliment, not a put down. What is it about being the salt of the earth that makes it a good thing? Well, salt seasons food. If you ever watch any of those cooking shows and a chef forgets to put salt in stuff, that's like the kiss of death. I mean, they're voted off the show if they didn't put salt in it, because salt is what's going to bring flavor to that food. And so salt is important for that reason. And we'll delve more into these and what they mean as we move along. But this one was interesting to me. Salt creates thirst. That's one of the old tricks, in the restaurants. Why do they give you the salty peanuts and the salty pretzels and things like that? Because they want you to order more drinks. And so they're hoping that you'll order drinks that cost money, but so if you order water, that kind of puts it over on them. But salt creates thirst. And what is it about us being the salt of the earth that matters? How is it that creating thirst is a good thing? So we'll get into those things in a minute. Salt back in those days especially was a symbol of purity. Things were purified by salt. We don't think about salt being associated with purification. Maybe in our, we have other things for using for purification today, but back in their day, salt was something they could use as a means of purifying things.
Well, it cures meat.
Right, absolutely, and that's on there. So salt was used in the Old Testament sacrifices. That was in some of the sacrifices, they were specified that they were supposed to include salt as part of those sacrifices. So that reveals something about its value as well. And then salt is a preservative. They didn't have refrigerators. They didn't have, a lot of ways that they could, if you slaughtered an animal and you didn't do something to preserve that meat, it wasn't going to last very long. And so they had means of curing it by salt so that it would last a lot longer. And so all of those things are kind of wrapped up in this statement of Jesus saying to us, you are the salt of the earth. There's a little hint of all of those things wrapped up in that statement. And like I say, he kind of lays these things out first, and then we'll get back into the application of that here in a few minutes. He goes on to, another aspect of being the salt of the earth. I thought this was interesting. Salt was valuable back in those days. Salt, they couldn't do what we do today to get salt. They couldn't dig down, 600 feet under the ground in Hutchinson or however deep those salt mines are and haul it up. They had to get it where they could, and it was sometimes a difficult, laborious process to get salt. And so it was very valuable. There are reports of salt sometimes being used as wages or as a supplement to wages. And it was interesting that when Roman soldiers received either payment in salt or a partial payment in salt, that was actually called a salarium. And SAL in Latin is the word for salt. And so where do we get our word salary today? It comes from the ancient practice of partial payment in salt. If you're an employer today, don't try that. I don't think your employees want salt, but yes.
Back a long time ago when Reed and Casey were over studying and studying abroad in Vienna, we went over to visit them, and there was this little village on the side of a mountain that was the oldest continuously inhabited village in Europe, named Holstock.
Okay.
And it was continuously inhabited because it had an access to salt. It was a little place that was hard to get to, but continued and over the centuries, it became, as you say, it was a very valuable commodity for them to be
Yeah.
able to mine in that location.
Yeah, and it, even in some places today, it continues. Ground that has access to a salt source can be a very valuable thing. So another aspect of that, added to those things that we just looked at on the last screen, why does it matter that Jesus calls us the salt of the earth? Well, salt is valuable, and we are valuable, and so Jesus makes that connection there by saying that we are the salt of the earth. So then, how does that work? You are the salt of the earth. Well, what does it mean? When we think of salt as being that thing that adds flavor to food, how does that impact us, or how does that relate to us being the salt of the earth? What does that mean?
I hope that when someone sees me, they see something different than someone who has worldview.
Yeah, I think so.
Someone, I mean, and I, 'cause I actually did have someone ask me some questions yesterday at school. We had a break. And so I was able to, refer to scripture. So hopefully someone sees something in me.
Yeah,
Maybe.
that statement kind of made me think of a scripture, 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13, sorry. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve, as do those who have no hope." If we think about salt adding the flavor, it's kind of weird to say that we are, as salt of the earth, we bring flavor to the earth. I'm not sure that's the word that we want to use as what it is that we bring to offer those who don't have what we have. But instead of the word flavor, maybe that word is hope. And we're the salt of the earth. And we are the access that some people have to hope in an otherwise hopeless world. And if that hope is the flavor, that's what gives life meaning, because without hope, what is life?
Hopefully we get an opportunity to mention and say things like, as long as we submit to God,
Yeah.
we will see the blessings that He gives to us.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between somebody who lives a life of hope versus somebody who lives a life with no hope for a future can be very stark when compared to one another, when placed side by side. And so, if salt is that comparison to those that have no hope, then I think that's a powerful comparison for us to make. So it's that flavor that makes life meaningful, just like salt is that which makes food edible, or food have more appeal.
Palatable.
Yeah, it has more appeal, and so hope gives life that flavor, gives life that appeal. What about salt being a preservative? How does that work with us?
We're preserving the examples and the teachings that Christ gave us.
Mm-hmm.
We're preserving that whenever we I don't know how to say it. We're the ones that go forth to proclaim His word, and we're preserving Jesus's legacy,
Okay.
as we do this.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think if you think of the way salt preserves, if you, and the way things happened for them back then when they slaughtered an animal, or if they went out hunting and they were hunting to put up stores for the winter or for the lean months, and they didn't have any way of preserving it, then very quickly that stuff goes bad, and then they have to make it through that lean time with no food, with no sustenance. And so if we are the preservatives that are preserving Christ's teachings about what it means to live a meaningful life, or what it means to live a purposeful life, then, you know, when the kill is fresh and everybody's got all the meat they want, there's probably some that don't worry too much about preserving stuff for later. But it's when the months get lean that then everybody has an interest in how was that preserved. And so the people that did a good job of preserving it become very popular then. And so when things are going well, it may be that people don't have any interest in hearing the things that we talk about or what we believe, but it's when things get lean that then all of a sudden people come to us and they want to know about what we believe or about what we think. And that, you know, that's that preservative. We have preserved a way of thinking or a way of life or a way of looking at life that they have lost because they gave it up to the cares of the world. But now all of a sudden they want to see that.
Jason.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a reason that in Deuteronomy 6 they talked about writing things on the doorposts and repeating the stories. As it's been said, we're one generation away from apostasy. So, I mean, if we don't preserve the truth for the next generation,
Mm-hmm.
the consequence is the truth dies out.
Absolutely. That's right. Being preservers is absolutely part of what God wants us to be. And then, you know, if salt is valuable, what does that mean to the Christian? What does that mean to us that we are the salt of the earth? Thinking about salt's value.
This one makes me think of what I've heard about salt, you know, in this passage is influence, that we can have influence or make a change or a difference, and just kind of back to if you've got something that's very bland and maybe you don't want to eat it, but for me anyway, you add a little salt and it's a little better, you know, that maybe our value is and the influence we can have for good and to turn people to the Word, you know, or hopefully to God.
Yeah. If we are not representing Christ to the world, who is going to?
Exactly.
I mean,
Otherwise, it's,
You-
because all we have so much confusion because of false teaching. We
Yeah.
have to.
so if you invent the greatest product ever known to man, and then you sit on it and you don't tell anybody about it, is it really the greatest product ever known to man?
No, because
It's
not
yeah,
known to man.
it's not known to man. And so, you know, we have the greatest news that's ever been, that's ever been. But if we're not telling people about it, is it really the good news? Well, I mean, yeah, it still is the good news. It still is the gospel of Christ. But if we're not telling anybody, then they don't know about it, and that's not okay. So we are valuable to Christ. We're valuable to God as their representatives of what they can do for people who've never heard of them, or people who don't know the truth. And so we are a valuable part of that exchange. So there you go. That's kind of what is wrapped up in the idea of being the the salt of the earth. What then about being the light of the world? You're the light of the world. And not as many things that they had listed or that I could think of that, you know, we think about salt being flavorful and valuable and preserving, and kind of had a long list of things that we talked about with salt. I think the list with light is a little shorter, but it's no less important. So light dispels darkness. Have you ever been in like one of those cave tours where you go underground or to the salt mines or whatever, and then they always do the thing where they turn off the light, right? Man, it's dark under there. And I was probably in middle school, junior high, 6th grade maybe, and we went to Lake of the Ozarks, and we went through a cave, and we got, I don't know how many far underground we were, but this was back in the day before cell phones and all that stuff. So nobody had a light on them except one guy. We were thankful there was a smoker in our group because he had a lighter. And when they took us down there, of course the guides knew, they turn off the lights. And it is dark. And then that one guy flicks on just a small little flame. And it is amazing how small of a light can dispel darkness in that cavernous room, and how comforting that small little light was to me as a ginormous sixth grader who was still scared of the dark. Probably clinging to my dad and who was wishing I wasn't. But that little light made it okay. And so, the idea there of light dispelling darkness, how much light do we need to dispel the darkness, to drive the darkness away? Well, really, there's a lot of darkness, but it doesn't take a whole lot of light to dispel that darkness, to get rid of darkness. And the thing about it is darkness and light can't coexist. If there's a spot that is light, the darkness can't overcome that light. Light can overcome darkness, but darkness can't overcome light. And light makes vision possible. Without light, down in that dark cavern, the expression, "you can't see your hand in front of your face," is a real thing. I mean, it didn't matter that my vision was good. What mattered was there was no light. And so without light, vision is impossible. No matter what it is lying in front of you, the truth of that thing that's lying in front of you can't be seen if there's no light. And so just a couple of things to think about is Jesus makes a statement about us being the light of the world, that it dispels the darkness and it makes vision possible. So kind of the flip side of that then, if we are the light of the world, what does that mean about the world? The world is dark. I mean, it's true that there are people living in darkness who don't have any idea they're living in darkness. They don't know that it's dark. And so we need to be that light, and as we shine that light forth, then we can illustrate for them the difference between the light and the dark. So the world is dark. That's just a true statement. And Jesus commented on that in John 3, verses 19 through 21, says, "This is the judgment, that the light is come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God." And so there's that contrast between light and darkness there. The world is a dark place, and those who are involved in doing the deeds of darkness like that it's a dark place. They like that their deeds are obscured, that their deeds are hidden from other people, or from from the people around them. Sure. It will be. Yep. And that's exactly right. Light always will win out. And so eventually the light of God's truth will shine upon every man, and there will be no hiding the deeds that they have been involved in. But those who are drawn to the light are those who, look at my deeds, go ahead and examine them, see what I've done, and I don't, there's nothing to be ashamed of. There's nothing to try and hide. So there is that aspect of it. Now, if you think about the way the world is going, and sometimes we think about our generation being the one where it's going over the edge or something, but I'm sure there have been aspects of every generation along the way that have been boldly proclaiming, evil. But think about the way our society is celebrating things that are evil right now, and they're not trying to hide those things. They're not trying to do those things in a closet or in the dark. They're doing those things right out in the open. And the 60s opened the door, didn't it? I wasn't there, but I've read about it. So, but we still have the task given to us to be the light that is shining truth on those deeds of darkness, even though people don't know those deeds are dark, even though people don't understand that what they're doing is wrong. We still have to shine the light of truth on those things. So, you're the light of the world. We are the light. The world is dark. That's inherent in that statement. And if we are the light of the world, means that light is necessary for vision to even work, and we are the light. That means that we have a part to play in helping people see. There are people that, just as we mentioned, there are people that don't know they're living in darkness, that don't know that darkness even exists. But we need to be shining the light so that they can see the contrast between what God has called us to versus the way they're living outside of God. And so if that contrast isn't clear, if that contrast is muddled, then we're not doing our job as being a light to the world. So we have a part in helping people to see. That is a real risk. That is a real risk that we undertake when we live the way God calls us to live, that people are going to disapprove of that. So, and that's okay. I thought of Jeremiah 10:23 says, I know, O Lord, that a man's way is not in himself, nor is it in a man who walks to direct his steps. And we know what that means. We know that it's God who we should be trusting to direct our steps. But there's a lot of people out there that don't understand that or they don't believe that. And so what is our job as the light of the world? It's to point them to that truth and say, there's a difference between the way you live and the way I live. And it's not because I'm so smart and you're not. It's because I'm following the leading of God and you're not. And we'll talk more about kind of that, using that language and kind of pointing at ourselves sometimes, which doesn't feel good, sometimes doesn't feel right, but sometimes that's necessary. But we have a part to play in helping people to see the way that they should be living. And if we are the light of the world, then we're fulfilling that. We're doing that. The other example I thought of was Saul of Tarsus. So you remember, as he's on the road to Damascus, what happens? There's a light, which is interesting. And what is the result of that light? He's blind, which kind of goes the opposite of what we've just been talking about, that in the world there's darkness, but it's all symbolic. It's all a metaphor. He's being taught a lesson. He's being taught a lesson that he has been ignoring and refusing the light. And now that he's seen it, he is suffering from the blindness that light actually brought him, which is representative of the way he's been living his life. He's been living his life in complete blindness, even though he thought he was living in the light. He thought he was doing everything right. He says later that, I've lived with a clean conscience before God up to this day. I thought what I was doing was okay, but I was actually walking in darkness. And he suffered 3 days of blindness as a very real and tangible thing happening to him to show him that he was walking in the darkness. But then how did he get his sight back? Somebody had to come show him the light. Ananias was sent to him, and when Paul was baptized, the scales fell from his eyes, and he was no longer blind, and he had accepted the truth, and now he was walking in the light. But Ananias was that light bringer, in a sense, to Saul's life, because he was the one that came and directed his steps, directed him in the direction that he should go. And so that's what we're talking about, being an Ananias to those who are blind in the world, and don't even, like Paul, didn't even realize he was blind, but he was. And then when he was confronted with the light of the truth, he realized his blindness, but he didn't know what to do about it. And so there was Ananias to teach him what he needed to do about his blindness. So the statement, you are the light of the world. So how is it that we are the light? We reflect God. Okay, that wraps it up. Because we are not the light. You're stealing my thunder. You're a smart woman. All right. So John 8:12. Therefore Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. And so the only way we get the light is by how? Following Jesus. He who follows me is not in darkness, but is in the light. Okay? But shall have the light of life. And so our only connection to the light is through Jesus. So if we are not following Jesus, we don't have the light. We're not the light of the world. The only way we are the light of the world is when we are following him. And so it's not our light that we are shining out into the world. It is a reflection of his light. We are simply conduits by which his light reaches other people. And we only can reflect that light or be that conduit if we are following him. Now think about the way that works. How much better, there's a couple of things there. If something comes between us and Christ, are we able to reflect his light? Well, no. I mean, his light is blocked off from us. We can't reflect his light if there's something between us and him. So we've got to make sure that we don't allow things to come between us and Christ. That affects the way that we're able to reflect his light to those around us. What if we start lagging behind and we get further and further away from Christ, and now all of a sudden he's way out there in the distance and I'm here? Am I going to be able to effectively reflect his light if I'm way back here lagging behind? No, the closer I follow him, the more vibrantly and brilliantly I'm going to be able to reflect his light. And so it's not just a matter of paying lip service to it, saying, yes, I'm a Christ follower, therefore I reflect his light. It's an intentional thing. I'm going to draw myself draw as closely to him as I can and make sure there are no barriers between me and him so that I can reflect his light most accurately and most vibrantly. We also have this verse in 1 John chapter 1, another familiar passage. It says, this is the message we have heard from him and announced to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. If we say that we have fellowship with him and yet walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin. So in John 8:12, who was the light? Jesus. In 1 John 1:5, who is the light? God the Father. And so do we have a contradiction here? Do we have Jesus and God at war with one another? No, they're both light. They're both beings of light. They are one, they're unified. There's not one that shines brighter than the other. There's not any difference in the way that they shine or in what they shine. They are completely and perfectly unified. And so to follow God through Jesus, his son, is the same as following Jesus, his son. And so when we follow one, we can't follow one without following the other. And so when we reflect the light of Christ, we are reflecting the light of the Father. And Jesus gave us that example as he talked about, wanting to do the will of his Father. Jesus always did the will of his Father, and if we are always doing the will of Jesus, then we're always doing the will of the Father as well. So they are unified to that extent. So the next section then he goes into is kind of the challenges that are presented by being salt and light. Greg? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
having to veil it. And now we're, in comparison to us, who with unveiled faces are reflecting.
Right. Yeah, so that's right. Moses had to protect God's glory by veiling his face, but we are supposed to exude God's glory by unveiling our face. The relationship that we have with God through Christ should be visible. It should be seen, and it should point towards God in everything that we do. And so that's one of the big distinctions between the old law and the new law that Paul is making there in 2 Corinthians 3. Good. I like that. I didn't think of that one. So he goes to the next section, the idea of there are some challenges that come with being the salt and the light. It's not like Jesus is saying, hey, you get to be the salt and the light, and that's going to make your lives perfect, and nothing bad is ever going to happen as a result of that. It's a good thing. It's something that we should celebrate. It's something that we should latch onto, that Christ calls us those things. But it doesn't mean that it's always going to be easy. Doesn't mean that our lives are going to be perfect. And so I like this statement. I copied this one straight out of the notes. It says, the challenge of being salt and light: salt preserves meat because salt is not meat. It's different than the meat. The reason it preserves the meat is because it can get in there and penetrate the tissue, and it's not meat. If you try to preserve a steak by rubbing chicken on it, the chicken and the steak are both going to go bad. But if you take the steak and you rub salt on it, it's going to preserve the steak. Okay, so salt preserves meat because it's not meat. It's profound, but it kind of makes you think, huh? And so what does that mean for us? We are the preservers of the world because we're salt. So what does that mean? We have to be different than the world. We can't preserve the world by being the world. We can't preserve the world by acting the same way the world acts. We have to be different than the world. And that's the way it works. So 1 John 2:15-17, do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away, and also its lusts. But the one who does the will of God abides forever. And so our task is to be different than the world and to call the world out of what it is to become like us, not for us to flirt as much as we can with the world and become as much like the world as we can, and without going too far. That's sometimes the trap that we fall into, that we kind of flirt with the world and we kind of get as close as we can, but I didn't get all the way in. I just stuck my toe in, and that was okay. But our job is to be over here where we're out of the world, and we are recognizing that what is in the world is all things that are passing away. They're not going to survive. And so we're trying to call people out of that to where we are. That's the preserving effect that we can have upon the world by being like salt. Another passage is Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. I urge you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. So how does salt preserve meat? It transforms the meat. It changes the meat. It's not, once you've totally penetrated that meat with salt, that meat is no longer exactly the same as it was before. And so how do we become the salt that we're supposed to be? Well, it's a transformational process. It's not conforming to the world, it's being transformed. We are changed. That we allow the gospel to change us into what God wants us to be, which is the Beatitudes, which is the first part. And then through that changing process, becoming the people and the character that God wants us to be, that's what makes us the salt. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are raised different people than we are when we went down into the waters of baptism. That's good. So challenges being salt. Salt preserves meat because it's not meat. So our first challenge is that we can't be the world. If we're going to be the salt, we can't be the world. What happens to salt that becomes tasteless? Yeah, it gets thrown out. Yeah, it's not good for anything. It's useless. We don't experience salt losing its saltiness much because the salt that we have is refined and it's purified and stuff like that. It can. And back then it was more of a, it was a more understandable metaphor or whatever this figure of speech is for them to have the idea that salt could go bad. It just doesn't happen for us. If you have a 10-year-old packet of salt, it's probably still pretty salty. But for them back then, if you didn't use the salt up, it may go bad. It may deteriorate. And so then once that happened, it was no longer valuable. The value that salt had was in its flavor and its ability to preserve. And once it's no longer got that, then it's useless. And you throw it out. It becomes nothing more than just something to cast on the way. So as the salt of the earth, if God has called us that, if he has put us in that position, if he's called us to that duty, and we're out there in the world being the world, or we're flirting with the world and we're not being salty, what good are we? Yeah. Yeah. Greg? Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. That's exactly right. And that gets back to one of the other things that was talked about at the beginning was that salt, it was a symbol of purity. And so contaminated salt that's a oxymoron. That's not, true salt can't be contaminated. Otherwise it's not salt anymore. And so if we're not fulfilling that role of salt that God has put us into, then what does that mean for us in the kingdom? We're not fulfilling our role as his children. Uh-huh. Yeah. 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 Okay. Keep the weeds out, maybe. So those are some of the challenges, the ideas of challenges that come with being the salt. That we've got to be the salt, not be the world. We've got to not lose our saltiness, not lose our taste, our flavor. Otherwise, we are not fulfilling the role that God has placed us into. But what about challenges of being light? He addresses or mentions some of those things. He maybe says more about that than he does about the salt even. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. And the question there is, what value is a light that is hidden? It's not doing what it's supposed to do. It's not dispelling the darkness. It's not making the path visible for other people to see. It's not bringing to light or bringing into our vision the truth. The truth might be right in front of us, but if there's no light to shine upon that truth, then we can't see it. And so light that isn't light that in actuality is darkness because it's hidden, is not worth anything as light. So what kind of things might hide our light? I've got notes. You guys, what kind of things might hide our light? Okay. Yeah. So what are some things that we could allow to get between us and Jesus? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Or things that become the focus. I mean, we might have something that would be a great talent or a great ability or a great avenue by which to reach people, but if that's the thing that becomes the focus and our focus is no longer on Christ, then we're not shining the light on Christ, we're shining a light on something else, and that's not okay. So there are several ways that we can think of, and he frames it in terms of what are the bushels we hide our light with, and he mentions ignorance, worldliness, half-heartedness, and worry are the four that he mentions, and any sin that we're involved in, which would, I guess, would fall under the idea of worldliness there, would go along with those things. Let's see, what does it mean to put our light on a lampstand? Okay, it's kind of the opposite of putting it under a bushel, right? I mean, if you have a lamp that's just sitting on the table and you put it under a bushel, that hides the light, but if you take it off the table and you put it on the lampstand, that makes more illumination. That makes the effect of the light greater than it even was just sitting on the table. And so it's elevating our lights. It's putting them in a prominent place so that they can be more easily seen, and it can spread its influence to a greater area. So this leads into that kind of the final part of the thought, when Jesus says, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And I know that sometimes because of our commitment to humility and meekness and things like that, sometimes we just don't want people to know that we're out doing good things. Or I was nice to somebody today, and what irritates me on Facebook is people that do these things and then they videotape them going out and giving food to the homeless, and they videotape themselves, doing this, and I'm looking for, I'm going to conduct a social experiment, and so I'm going to go drop my billfold in the street and see if somebody gives it back to me. Those kind of things irritate me because I don't feel like those are what we're supposed to be doing to shine our light. Yeah, but I like this statement here. This is another quote from the notes. It says there's a difference. Well, I'm not sure I worded that right. There's a difference between doing works to be seen and doing works that are seen. And so if we are going out to do works so that we can be seen, that is, we get our end result when we're seen. That's what we were after. But if we're going out and doing things that are seen, and as people see them, we're able to glorify God and we're able to give Him the credit, or we're able to point the light at Him, then that's a difference. It's a different connotation there. And so when Jesus says that last question there, why is it important to let our light shine? We let our light shine because it gives glory to God. It's not about glorifying ourselves. It's not about pointing this light at us. It's about pointing the light at God and making sure that He receives the glory for what it is that we've done. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. That's right. God who sees in secret will reward in secret. And so that kind of wraps it up. That we are the salt, we are the light, and it's a good thing, and it gives us some indication of how valuable God sees us as being. That we have a role to play, we have a purpose to fulfill, and that He is relying on us to fulfill that purpose. That He built this kingdom around the idea of us being salt and light, and if we're not being salt and light, it's His kingdom that is not fulfilling its purpose, that it's His kingdom that is going to suffer because of that. And that gives us, that is our worth. That's who we are. Mm-hmm. All around McPherson. Yeah. Yeah. Servants, yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think you're exactly right. That's a great tie-in of what it means to be salt and light. And I think in order to be people that do the things that you're talking about, we need to be people who have the character of the Beatitudes that leads to us being the salt and light that lead us out to doing those things that he mentions in Matthew 25. There's a great tie-in there. Wow, Gary would be proud we made it through 4 verses.